Tina Fordham, founder of Fordham Global Foresight and an analyst of geopolitical risk. And Tina, there are a lot of geopolitical risks at the moment. The word inflection point is something that has been thrown around a lot for this year, for the year of 2024, even before it started. Does it still ring true to you?
Yes, well, I called my 2024 outlook inflection point, but at the time I said, well, it could be worse. I could be calling it tipping point. And I think, therefore, it is still fair to say, with a small amount of optimism, that we may avoid the worst outcome of the world being at a tipping point and, going over into the abyss. But the idea that the elections this year, especially obviously the US elections and the hot wars that are taking place between Russia and Ukraine and in the Middle East, as well as other conflicts, are really weighing on the economic outlook, the financial outlook, as well as on global institutions, and the humanitarian situation is impossible to get away from. There is a lot happening at once, and it's really straining the seams of the global system.
Well, and we will get to some of those, but just to follow up on that, first of all, perhaps unpack a little more for us why you feel we are still at the inflection point. I mean, I think many people listening to the news today might feel we have reached that tipping point. Where is the optimism that we're not at the abyss just yet?
Well, in my discipline, I am a political scientist by training. We tend to think about global developments in terms of institutions. Institutions, the rule of law, central banks, the courts, even the media, etc. These are the building blocks that help keep the ecosystem that we live in place and prevent things from getting worse. The strength of institutions, even softer factors like trust that people have between each other and between themselves, government, neighbors, etc., are what keep things stable and allow us to manage these periods of more confrontation and more conflict. And so the source of optimism is that our institutions manage to hold up and withstand these pressures. As someone who's originally from the US, now based in Europe for the last 23 years, I look at the US elections almost the way I did when I started my career in finance as an emerging markets analyst, where we're looking at whether these institutions will survive and be able to mitigate the risks.
So the institutions are just about still holding, in other words. And as you did bring up the U.S. elections, that is one that we wanted to focus on first of all, because they are under 30 days away now. And that is one where there's a question for some people of, whether the institution will hold or not. How do you look at the sort of scenarios and the possible outcomes? How will they matter for the globe?
Well, as we head into this race, even though there have been so many extraordinary twists and turns, from Biden leaving the race to the Trump assassination attempt and Kamala Harris rising to the top of the ticket, what's really extraordinary, even compared to other elections, is how stable the polls are. 1 point in either direction could actually translate into a pretty sizable victory in the Electoral College for the winner. So the first thing is all bets are off. You're not seeing very many pollsters make forecasts, and that points to how high the stakes are. This is the fifth US election that I've covered professionally. And if we think back to other times when there has been that disconnect between the Electoral College and the popular vote, in 2016 between Hillary Clinton and Trump, or 2000 Bush Gore, what needs to happen if we get an election outcome that's referred to the Supreme Court is for people to accept that outcome. Now, in 2000, Al Gore wasn't very happy about the Supreme Court decision, but he accepted it. And so a question we have to ask now, given that U.S. public support, belief in the Supreme Court has dropped to about 20%, is whether that would happen again. And that's going to be the test of the institutions, as well as, quite simply, just the machinery of the vote counting.
And then speaking of some contradictory messaging, I suppose, that you have to unpack, when it comes to the Middle East conflict at the moment, we are at the 1 year mark since the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel. One of the things that's been interesting about this is that perhaps it hasn't had such a huge economic impact on the world, but you have recently seen oil prices starting to rise in response to the conflict. Where is that coming from? And do you get a sense then that we are now seeing maybe wider implications of this conflict?
Well, the concern has been all along about whether the confrontation, the conflict between Israel and Hamas, would remain contained to Gaza, where there isn't energy infrastructure, or whether the conflict would escalate, especially to the point where it might involve state-to-state conflict between Israel and Iran. In the past, before U.S. shale gas and energy independence, a conflict of these proportions would have moved oil prices. That hasn't been the case. Oil has been rather low at around $72 a barrel, going up to 75 last week. But again, with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and in the Middle East, those are two parts of the world where you could see an impact on growth and on asset prices. And that's what makes these conflicts more impactful for markets in the global economy than places like Sudan, for example, Afghanistan, etc. So we're really in a precarious situation with that in mind. But I suspect markets will continue to be complacent, even as we have these massive bombing attacks going on by Israel in Lebanon, unless or until Iran responds. And that's the shoe that we're waiting to drop right now. How will Israel rather respond to Iran's firing of 200 ballistic missiles last week? When oil prices moved a few days ago, it was following comments from President Biden saying that they were looking with Israel at attacking Iran's energy infrastructure. So that's what accounted for that action.
And just finally, Tina, I mean, you mentioned there perhaps some of this complacency in the markets. I wonder if there is something else that you are keeping an eye on as a geopolitical strategist. You mentioned a number of conflicts there and through this conversation. Is there something else that perhaps the markets are not watching that you are advising your clients about?
What I have found interesting during the course of, the 25 years that I've been doing this is how differently business leaders in different parts of the world view events. There's still a lot more optimism in Asia and indeed in the United States and the Middle East than there is here in Europe. We are very much exposed and in the crosshairs. We're looking at technology, AI as a source of growth and innovation. But hearkening back to work that I did earlier with the United Nations on gender equality, one way that we could see more growth is to reduce barriers to entry for women in the workforce. And that maybe takes us back to the US point that sometimes the mechanisms for bringing about more growth, better standards of living can often be just policymakers getting barriers out of the way.